This week, the FT revealed that ministers are grappling with the likely cost of compensating victims of what's been described as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. The contaminated blood scandal, which dates back to the 1970s and 80s, is a grim saga. Ministers accept the moral case for compensation and are privately saying it could cost between £5 to £10 billion. I'm joined by Sarah Neville, our global health editor, and by Barry Flynn, ex-chairman of the Haemophilia Society. He's in his 60s and was infected with hepatitis C, and he and his family have suffered terribly. Sarah, first of all, can you explain what happened?
Yes, well, if I can inject a slightly personal note here, I remember back in the mid-80s when I was a young reporter on a regional paper in South Wales, and the shock we felt when it emerged that some of the local hospitals had got blood that was contaminated with HIV. And HIV itself was quite a newly diagnosed disease. And I think this started to slightly sort of reframe the narrative around HIV, which at that time was still being depicted by the tabloids as a gay plague. And suddenly here was evidence that you could go into hospital and have a regular blood transfusion, or particularly be a haemophiliac looking to have a blood clotting agent called factor VIII, and you could end up contaminated with this disease. The key issue was that the supplies of factor VIII that were contaminated had been imported from the United States. So I think perhaps one of the sort of ironies, Barry will tell us more about this, but that factor VIII, this relatively new clotting agent, was seen as almost like a sort of miracle treatment that meant that haemophiliacs no longer had to spend very long periods in hospital. And so this emergent evidence in the mid-80s that, in fact, it had proved profoundly damaging to many of them was really shocking.
And when did the NHS and the government accept that this has happened?
Well, even back then in the mid-80s, it was already acknowledging that this had happened. And that was when they started to heat treat the factor VIII, the clotting agent. So I guess you could say almost 40 years ago, it was accepted. But what's taken a painfully long time is to get to the point of achieving any sort of a framework for workable compensation. And I think some of the ministers who gave evidence to the public inquiry that's still ongoing were very frank in acknowledging that this had been a serial failure of administration after administration. It had been, I think, Jeremy Hunt, who's now the Chancellor, but of course was a very long-serving health secretary. He told the inquiry that the failure of successive administrations to find a resolution represented a failure of the British state. So there's certainly been no lack of acknowledgement by the current crop of politicians that something went very, very badly wrong here.
So Barry, what was your own experience and that of your family of this dreadful affair?
Well, you've got it dead right there, Sarah. The treatment from the point of view of myself and my brother was, after a lifetime thus far of growing up with long spells in hospital, unable to do any kind of sport virtually, pretty much stuck in the house, damaged joints because we spent a lot of time either in wheelchairs or on crutches or wearing calipers, etc. Just in time for us to get our O-levels and A-levels, my brother and I started taking home treatment just in time to get us off to university. And life was transformed. And I did biochemistry. It was kind of in the 80s when, having sort of stayed in touch with certain scientific papers and things, I got wind of this HIV black cloud that was coming over from America and, rumors of it going down through blood. And I guess I started modifying my behavior somewhat, because the Hemophilia treatment center I was calling into to get my medication, you'd get various brands of it. And I was frankly nervous of American brands. So I would undertreat myself, build up stocks of the UK medication and try not to use the American stuff. Sometimes it was unavoidable, and try to get my brother to do the same. I don't know how much he listened to me. My brothers don't. But I distinctly remember the day when I got a call from a doctor because I'd been getting a test for HIV, and he said, "You're negative." And so I was happy, but he said, "Well, you're negative, but that's just one test. It's not a very good test. We'll have to do 4, 5, 6 tests before we can say you don't have it." And then I had to ring my brother, and he told me he was positive. I mean, we had no idea what the ramifications of that were at the time, thank God in a way. But that was when the nightmare began, if you like, around about 1986.
So you were infected with hepatitis C, weren't you, I think, at this point?
Yes, so at that point, people were vaguely talking about non-A, non-B hepatitis, because virtually everybody who got blood products got hepatitis B, which meant you had the flu-like symptoms for a while and went a funny color and what have you. But then it tended to settle down to all intents and purposes. But nobody knew much about this non-A, non-B, but it became vaguely, known that most haemophiliacs had that as well.
So both you and your brother were infected by contaminated blood.
Yes.
What was it like trying to be heard by the NHS, by the government? What was the official response?
I wasn't aware of a response at the time, frankly. At the time, HIV was, death sentence. So I just felt awesome sorrow for my brother. And, we tried to rally around him as, the situation became more and more stark. Because frankly, the doctors were in shock as well. I don't know how much training they got in how to deliver these messages, but they pretty much, gave it to them right between the eyes. I remember my brother in tears ringing me up because him and his wife were trying for family, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like, I wouldn't bother because you're not going to live long enough to enjoy being parents. Unwittingly, my brother had infected his wife. So tragically, she ended up dying as well.
And your brother died too?
Yep.
So Sarah Neville, Sir Brian Langstaff published an interim report into the scandal last month, making it clear that ministers should set up a compensation scheme immediately. Is that going to be straightforward?
It's not, because I think one of the things that still has to be decided is how the payments are going to be weighted, how they're going to place a value on different aspects of loss of earnings power. I mean, one of the things that Sir Brian announced in his most recent report was that he wanted the relatives who could be compensated to be expanded from bereaved partners, who he mentioned in a report last year should be compensated. But the latest report, he said also children who had lost parents should be compensated, and indeed parents who had lost children. So that, of course, greatly expanded the pool of people who are going to be entitled to compensation.
And I think siblings of children who are infected, carers, I mean, quite a big group of affected people.
Which I guess is how we're getting up to that very high figure, George, that you had a good scoop on just a few days ago. I think that was 10 billion, wasn't it?
5 to 10 billion.
Is being bandied around within government as a likely cost. So, yes, it's an extraordinary bill coming home to roost after all these years, after these, 40, 50 years since this actually happened. It was the supplies from the US that were contaminated. And what happened was, I think there was originally a pledge that the UK would become self-sufficient in factor 8. That hadn't happened. There was a huge demand. The NHS, the government, wound up filling that demand by importing from the US.
So, Barry, what sort of compensation do you think those infected and affected should be receiving after all these years of suffering?
Well, I think, talking about the cost is the wrong way of looking at it. If you're talking about the cost, it's a fraction of the cost of the nuclear submarines program. It's a small fraction of the cost of High Speed 2 and its dubious benefits. We are a gigantic economy, and focusing on the cost is the wrong way around. I would much rather focus on the value to the thousands of people who have had their lives massively blighted by it. Imagine being a young child who watches his parents, at least one of his parents, if not both of them, take years to die a hideous, protracted death. It's one, and the other one has to give up work to look after them. If they were left orphans, brothers and sisters were split up and sent to different parts of the country to be institutionalized in various ways. My parents had to watch their daughter-in-law and son die an awful death. Any hopes they had of grandkids went out the window from that point of view. Both died, didn't even care about compensation, I don't suppose. But, it's blighted lives, and compensation is some measure that the government accepts that it was their fault.
Sarah, you've covered the NHS for many years. Does it surprise you that there was this sort of period where the authorities just seemed to be in denial and not hearing voices like Barry's?
I think, sadly, there's a long history of the NHS trying to avoid acknowledging scandals like this. I mean, we've seen it particularly through multiple maternity scandals, which have only come to light many, many years later. I mean, I'm not saying that whistleblowing particularly came into play with this affair, but it is very hard to be a whistleblower in the NHS because it's a culture of closing ranks where there is resistance to acknowledging anything that could lead to a compensation bill. So sadly, I think this does come in a long line of similar occasions where there's been fault and the NHS has been slow to acknowledge it.
And Barry, finally, do you think we're finally getting towards a point of closure after this whole sad affair?
My faith in government has been shaken over the decades. So, I'll believe it when I see it. They still seem to be, trying to focus on the cost rather than really genuinely seeming to be giving regular updates on how they're getting along, putting this mechanism together and finding the money. The numbers are terrible, but the statistics are even worse when it comes to people with bleeding disorders. They talk about 3,000 people having died, but what isn't focused on is that there are only anytime about 6,000 haemophiliacs in the country because it's 1 in 10,000. And of those, 2,000 are severely affected. So in the context of that, when you read statistics, like 1,400 people with haemophilia were infected with HIV, that is 50-60% of severe haemophiliacs. There's not many other instances where you could point to a segment of the population and say the NHS were responsible for the deaths of half of that group of people. Every 3 weeks, another person dies of either HIV or hepatitis. I didn't say, this HIV thing, it was like a rapid wave hitting you. So the deaths came quickly and then the treatment came and the death stopped. But the hepatitis is just like a creeping death thing because it takes place over years and even decades. But once you've got cirrhosis and liver damage and liver cancer, then, it's just slow and inexorable and it isn't going to stop. So the longer the government faff on with this, people are dying every month. It's a disgrace. It should have been done decades ago. Several countries, even Ireland, they paid out in the 90s. So all this talk about 5 to 10 billion, well, you should have spent 50 million 40 years ago and there wouldn't have been the problem.
Barry Flynn and Sarah Neville, thanks for joining me. And that's it for this episode of the FT's Political Fix. If you like the podcast, we'd recommend subscribing. You can find us through all the usual channels to receive episodes as soon as they're released. We also appreciate positive reviews and ratings. The FT's Political Fix was presented by me, George Parker, and produced by Anna Dedder. The executive producer is Manuela Saragossa, and the sound engineer is Breen Turner. Until next time, thanks for listening.